Have you ever felt watched, even when you're silent, alone without saying a word? That feeling that there's something or someone watching your every move, even when no one else is around. What if I told you that maybe not even God was watching? This question may sound like a forbidden whisper, but it has echoed for millennia among those who have dared to challenge the common sense of faith. After all, do God's eyes truly see everything? Or are there moments, places, and intentions that escape, or are ignored by this divine vision? Could it be that, at the beginning of creation, there was something the Creator himself chose not to see? Since Genesis, we've heard that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, but there are gaps that traditional theology doesn't address, silences that are disturbing, passages that have never been read from the pulpit. What you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps change the way you view God himself. True spirituality is not afraid of doubt. It invites it closer, and that is why today, in this deep dive into mysteries of creation, let's explore not only what God sees, but what he chooses to see. Or worse, what he chooses not to see. Have you ever imagined a God who turns his face away? A God who hides himself? This possibility is more present in Scripture than many would like to admit. Stay with me until the end, because we're not just talking about theology, but about a spiritual enigma that touches your life in ways you may never have realized. This isn't a story about religion. It's a revelation about conscience, judgment, and divine choice. A journey through hidden riddles of the beginning of creation, where every hidden detail can reveal truths that have been kept secret for centuries. And in the midst of this mystery, there is a decision that can change everything. Is God's gaze upon you inevitable or conditional? But before we answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, long before the light, long before the first word. Because perhaps the first thing God ever did was choose what you didn't want to see. What if this also happens today? What if there are situations, feelings, or even choices you make that God simply chooses not to notice? The idea may be uncomfortable, even frightening, but opens a rare door, the chance to reflect on the kind of divine presence that inhabits or is absent from your life. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far. Have you ever felt like God wasn't watching? Or perhaps chose not to intervene? Sharing these experiences can open doors for others seeking answers beyond the obvious. And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes the importance of content like this, deeper, bolder, more connected with the mysteries of creation. So I sincerely ask you, watch this video right now. It's not just about numbers. It's about showing the algorithm in the world that there's still a thirst for authentic spiritual revelation. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel now. This isn't just a click. It's a clear sign that you want to be part of this journey, where each video is a key to unlocking what was hidden between the lines of creation. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, which most avoid touching. Now, take a deep breath, because the next revelation may change what you mean by divine insight. Let's go deeper. Since ancient times, prophets, kings, and even angels have feared the divine gaze. It wasn't just any fear. It was a deep, reverent, almost physical awe, as if the mere sight of being seen by God were both a privilege and a sentence. In the Scriptures, this gaze is described as penetrating, absolute, capable of probing even the most secret thoughts of the heart. But what if this vision isn't so absolute? What if there are secrets, deep, dangerous, uncomfortable, that not even God's eyes want to see? It may seem like heresy at first glance. After all, we've always been taught that God sees all, knows all, observes all. But in some hidden, forgotten, or ignored passages, there are hints of a much more complex truth, a hidden truth that sheds new light on divine consciousness. In Isaiah, we read that God hid his face. In Lamentations, that he turned away his look. This doesn't seem just a metaphor. It seems like a choice, a conscious decision not see. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this possibility changes everything. If God's eyes are as selective as they are omniscient, then creation is not only an act of power, but also of discernment. It's not just about knowing everything, but about what worth knowing, what deserves to be considered, and what should be ignored. And at this point, a question begins to whisper in the mind. Who defines what is worthy of the divine gaze? Perhaps God's gaze is less like a surveillance camera and more like a spiritual lens that penetrates the layers of reality, focusing only on what resonates with his will. This would transform the way we view our own spirituality, our decisions, our mistakes, and even our intentions. Because if he chooses to see, then he can also choose not to see. Or worse, can choose not to see you. This isn't a threat. It's a provocation to consciousness. It's a call to look within more deeply, with more courage. Because perhaps we're not invisible by accident, but by distance. Perhaps there's something in our mindset, our attitudes, that closes the divine's eyes to us. A kind of silent spiritual code that determines when we are seen and when we are left on the margins. But what about the beginning of everything? Back in the beginning, when creation was still chaos and darkness, did this criterion already exist? Could it be that, even before the light, God was already filtering what he wanted to perceive? This is where the mystery intensifies. Because if we believe it all began with "let there be light," we need to ask ourselves, who or what was there before the light was said? And if God's eyes see everything, what did he see in that void? Or was it that in that primordial instant, he chose not see? Imagine the backstage of eternity. A space before time, before sound, before matter. An environment where only divine intention existed. What if it was in this silence that God made his first conscious decision, not to create, but to ignore what was there, as if the act of seeing were as sacred as that of speaking, as if the first separation, light and darkness, were also a separation between what would be seen and what would be forgotten. This perspective completely changes the meaning of creation, because it transforms God not into a passive spectator of the universe, but into an architect who chooses every detail with purpose, a creator who doesn't see everything, but who decides what to see, when to see it, and why to see it. And this decision is more spiritual than we imagine. It's about alignment, frequency, purpose. So the question that remains is not just whether God sees everything. Be it if you are living in a way that he chooses to see that, there's something in your journey, in your essence, that calls to this gaze? Or could it be that, at some point, you too have been forgotten by this all-pervading gaze? Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too," because this quest isn't just mine. It's for everyone who feels like something bigger is watching them or avoiding them. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we talk about God's gaze, we inevitably come across the anchor scripture, those passages that, for centuries, have sustained the belief that nothing escapes God's vision. Proverbs 15 verse 3 states that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. Psalm 139, perhaps one of the most intimate declarations of God's presence, says, "You have searched me and known me. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely." Powerful words, strong, but at the same time, surrounded by a certain interpretive silence. Because there is one question that is never asked. Are these passages literal or symbolic? If they are literal, then we are all under absolute surveillance, with no room for shadows or oblivion. But if they are symbolic, what exactly do they symbolize? An emotional presence? A higher consciousness? Or simply a metaphor for the sense of divine justice that, at some point, judges every heart? The answer is not as simple as it seems. Because even within the Bible, there are moments when God himself seems to contradict this idea of constant vigilance. In the book of Genesis, after Cain kills Abel, God asks, "Where is your brother?" This sounds strange coming from an all-seeing God. In Exodus, during the time when the enslaved Hebrew people groaned for deliverance, we read, "And God heard and remembered." How so? The all-seeing God remember at a given moment? And if remembering is different from seeing, then what does this divine vision really mean? These details, these forgotten behind-the-scenes details of the sacred text, reveal a more subtle, perhaps more human, layer of divinity, a layer that doesn't ignore its omniscience, but also expresses intentionality. It's not about seeing everything all the time. It's about choose what to see at the right time, as if even vision were a form of mercy or judgment. And this radically changes our spiritual mindset, because it shifts our relationship with the divine from a place of passivity to one of impact, of response. We are seen when we are called, and we are ignored when we are not aligned, not as punishment, but as a consequence of our decisions, our frequency, our way of existing. It is as if God's vision were a mirror that not only reflects, but reacts. And perhaps that is why in so many sacred texts, especially the less commented ones, we find moments in which God hides his face. He doesn't disappear. He just looks away. And behind this gesture, so silent, so symbolic, lies a hidden truth that tradition rarely mentions. The divine gaze can be suspended, it can be avoided, or even refused, because just as there is light, there is shadow, and just as there is presence, there is concealment. The spiritual journey is not just about being seen by God. It's about living in such a way that this look becomes inevitable, and this involves real choices, internal stances, connections that go beyond religion. It's a call to transformation, not to impress the sacred, but to awaken the consciousness that invites it. When we think of the divine gaze as a lens that chooses where to rest, we realize how much our essence is at stake. It's not about being good or bad. It's about being awake or asleep, about vibrating at a frequency compatible with the all-pervading gaze. Because perhaps God's eyes are not everywhere at once, but rather everywhere there is truth, and the truth is not always visible. Comment here, that makes sense to me. Because sometimes recognizing doubt is a first step to seeing the mystery. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because most people grew up with a one-sided idea of the divine gaze, as if it were a celestial camera, cold, constant, uninterrupted. But the spiritual reality seems to be much more subtle, and perhaps much more human than we've been told. Some apocryphal texts, hidden from popular versions of Scripture, suggest something simultaneously disturbing and liberating. God chooses what he sees. And more than that, there are times when height gets stuck or moves away. This idea breaks with the comfort of an ever-present God, but it also invites us to delve into a starker, yet essential truth. There are layers to this gaze, layers of intention, of connection, of purpose. In certain forgotten writings, such as the book of Enoch, we read of the watchers, angels sent to observe, but who ultimately strayed from their mission. What does this reveal to us? That even the act of seeing can be corrupted, that there is power in the gaze, and that this power carries consequences. If the watchers fail to observe with purity, could it be that the Creator himself also sets limits on what should and should not be seen? Not out of limitation, but out of sacred choice? It's as if the act of seeing were also a form of judgment, and there are times when silence is the sentence. When God doesn't speak, when God doesn't look, it doesn't mean absence. It means a different kind of presence, a presence that watches behind the veil, that allows human decisions to unfold until the truth reveals itself. In Psalms, David cries out, "Hide not your face from me." This wouldn't be necessary if God were always, unconditionally, watching. This request reveals an ancient fear, that of being ignored by the source of life. And this fear, more than theological, is existential, because to be seen is also to be recognized, to be affirmed, to be loved. And when we feel that God has turned his face away, something inside us asks, what have I done to be forgotten? Perhaps you've experienced this without realizing it. Those moments when everything seems empty, when prayers don't resonate, when spirituality seems like a distant echo. No one tells you, but perhaps this is the sacred space where God's gaze has been suspended, and not as punishment, but so that something within you could be revealed. There is wisdom in this detachment. There is an invitation to silent transformation, to inner realignment. In the mystical tradition, there is a notion that God's gaze can be a fire, one that illuminates but also consumes. And not every soul is ready for this kind of exposure. Therefore, the Creator sometimes chooses not to look, as if protecting that which is still in process, as if waiting for the right time to see and intervene. This hidden truth is everywhere, but has been ignored by ready-made speeches and rigid doctrines. They didn't tell you that there are secrets that only blossom in absence, that there are moments of shadow, not because the divine has abandoned you, but because it is giving you space to grow without the pressure of being seen. Because invisible growth is the most powerful. Silent transformation is the most enduring. And perhaps, when you feel God isn't looking, that's exactly when he is most attentive, but from a distance. observing not with his eyes, but with time. This changes everything, doesn't it? It changes how you interpret spiritual silence. It changes how you approach your decisions, your journey, your pain. Because perhaps what feels like abandonment is a heightened kind of trust, a sign that there's something inside you that needs to mature without direct light, like seeds that only sprout in the dark. So, rather than asking yourself, is God seeing me? Perhaps the right question is, what is he waiting to look at in me? Because when that gaze arrives, it will reveal not only what you are, but what you become in the meantime. And this revelation has not only a spiritual, but an existential impact, a kind of awakening, an awareness that transcends religion, that transcends belief, that reconnects you with your most intimate and invisible self. Comment here. That makes sense to me, because recognizing that even God can be silent is starting to listen to what divine silence is trying to tell you. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because there's a point in the spiritual journey where the clear vision of the divine fades, and everything seems to hide behind a thick, silent veil. It is at this very point that a concept as ancient as it is poorly understood emerges: divine concealment, the idea that the Creator himself, at certain moments, hides his face off creation. This appears in Isaiah 45, verse 15, in a cryptic verse that says, "Surely you are God who hides yourself." But why would an omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient God shouldn't look for what he himself created? The answer is not simple, because it inhabits the realm of hidden truth. And hidden truth always challenges the surface. Perhaps divine hiddenness is not absence, but as spiritual strategy is silent movement that provokes man to leave his comfort zone, to search more deeply, to dig beyond appearances. Because God's silence is turning away can have more impact on the soul than any direct revelation. Some see this silence as punishment, others as protection. But there is also a third way, transformation, because only those who have experienced the apparent absence of the divine understand how much it shapes faith in a more mature, sincere, and intimate way. When God hides, it is not the end. It is an internal restart. It's as if the light were present, but inviting us to see with different eyes, with the eyes of the soul. In Kabbalah, for example, this separation from the divine is seen as a necessary space for free will to exist, as if God, by concealing his presence, gives us the chance to choose without coercion. This is tremendous, because it means that divine love manifests itself even in an act of not interfering. And what's more, it means that God's gaze, however vast, is governed by wisdom, not by blind vigilance. This separation, however, is not permanent. It is intimately linked to our decisions, our mindset, the way we connect with or distance ourselves from what is sacred. It is as if the divine gaze dances with our consciousness, responding to the frequency we emanate when we align with truth, not dogmatic truth, but the one that pulses within us. Then something happens, a kind of subtle revelation where we feel again that we are being seen, recognized, loved. Therefore, God's hiding of his eyes can indeed be judgment, but it can also be mercy. Sometimes the soul needs to go through the dark night, the feeling of being invisible, to rediscover its own brilliance. The absence of God's gaze can be the mirror that shows us what we truly are when there is no applause, when there is no immediate response. And there, in that emptiness, the most important decisions of the spiritual journey arise. It's in these silent scenes that faith is tested, that the ego is dismantled, that connection ceases to be religious and becomes visceral. Because when all else fails and God seems distant, what remains is essence. It's the spark that moves us, even without certainty, even without a clear vision. And perhaps this is the greatest secret of creation. God does not hide his face out of weakness. He hides his face because he knows there is something in us that only blooms in the dark, like a seed that needs to be buried before it can touch the light, like a sacred process that demands silence so as not to be interrupted prematurely. This is not abandonment. It is preparation. It is polishing. And here, once again, we return to the question that no one wants to ask. Why would the Creator hide his eyes from his own creation? Why does he want to punish us? Or is it because he knows there are times when vision can get in the way of the process? Perhaps it's like looking at a work in progress. Too soon, everything seems confusing, but at the right time, it makes sense. And until that time arrives, All we have is faith, a faith that walks blindfolded but with an open heart, a faith that understands that not being seen now doesn't mean being forgotten. It means the invisible is at work, that something is being generated silently within us. Comment here. The invisible also shapes, because there are things that are only born when the sky seems silent. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because when we talk about the divine gaze and its possible absence, there's a detail that almost no one dares to explore, precisely because it inhabits the forgotten corners of uncanonized scriptures, forbidden books, and accounts that traditional religion prefer to silence. It's not always God who sees. There are ancient records that speak of beings whose sole purpose was to observe, beings who saw everything but said nothing, beings called vigilantes. In the book of Enoch, one of the most enigmatic and disturbing texts in ancient Jewish tradition, and one that has been excluded from most Bibles, we find a clear description of these beings. They are not just angels. They are assigned a specific function: observe the earth and men. They are eyes from heaven that do not belong to God directly, but that were at the service of his will. And here we begin to see something that dismantles a conventional idea of divine omnivision as a fixed and indivisible attribute. According to Enoch's account, the watchers were sent to observe, but ended up being enchanted by what they saw. They crossed boundaries. They transgressed spiritual boundaries. They became entangled with creation. And for this, they were punished, silenced, cast into the abyss. The question that lingers is, why would the Creator allow others to observe in his place? And furthermore, why would he let them fall? Perhaps God's gaze is more selective than we imagine. And perhaps the watchers were an extension of the divine desire not to directly observe human chaos, to maintain a certain distance from matter, from flesh, from transgression. It is as if God himself, in his purity, chose to delegate his gaze, like a king who does not directly see what transpires in the shadows of the kingdom, but sends spies, messengers, sentinels. And if these eyes fail, become corrupt, or rebel, silence ensues. The impact of this revelation is profound, because it places us before a new spiritual architecture. Not every look is divine, but there are looks that carry the responsibility of heaven. And this leads us to reflect on what it means to be observed. Is everything you do, everything you feel, truly under Creator's gaze? Or are there moments when you're seen by other eyes, eyes that don't judge, but simply record? The book of Enoch describes the watchers as beings with knowledge, language, and power, but who have been corrupted by their proximity to humanity. This shows us that seeing, on the spiritual plane, is more than an act of perception. It is an act of exposure. When we are seen by someone or something unprepared to handle who we are, we become vulnerable. And perhaps that's why God chose not to look directly at certain things. Perhaps it's a way of protecting, not punishing. And if so, everything changes. Because the absence of divine gaze at certain moments may not be judgment, but preservation, a way to keep our essence away from the impact of an exposure we're not yet ready for. The watchers failed by trying to see what they didn't yet understand. And this reveals a hidden truth. Not all knowledge is allowed at all times. Not every vision is safe. Knowing this, our spiritual mindset needs to mature. The journey becomes less about being observed and more about prepared to be worthy of the gaze. And here it's not about merit in the moralistic sense, but about vibration, of being in a state where the divine can look and rejoice, look and draw near, and not turn away as it did in so many silent passages of sacred history. The watchers are connected to this. They are a mirror of the human desire to be seen, and the risk of looking unprepared. They are a reminder that revelation has layers, and that not every look is a blessing. Some eyes see and corrupt, others observe and report, and Creator, above all this, observes wisely. He chooses the right time, the exact hour. And meanwhile, many of us are being watched through eyes that are not his. Comment here, not every look is sacred. Because understanding this can be the beginning of a new perception of what it truly means to live under the eyes of the divine. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because if the watchers represent the eyes that were allowed to see and failed, there's another, even more disturbing biblical scenario where the number of eyes multiplies infinitely. These are not human eyes. They are not angelic eyes in the traditional sense. They are eyes on bodies we continue to misunderstand, on wheels, on wings, on beings that surround the very throne of God. Ezekiel saw them. John saw them too. But do we truly understand what they saw? In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes the living creatures surrounding the throne. They had 4 faces for wings and eyes, many eyes, on each side, on each part, in every direction. In Revelation, John describes beings with 6 wings, 2 full of eyes inside, and out weary not just talking about a symbolic aesthetic. We're dealing with a spiritual architecture whose goal seems to be a multiplied vision, to make God's throne the center of complete, total, absolute field of observation. But then the question arises, are these his eyes, or were they created to see what he chooses not to see? If the throne is surrounded by beings covered with eyes, perhaps the Creator doesn't need to look directly. Perhaps he simply allowed everything to be seen through them, and here again, we touch on a hidden truth. The vision of God may not be in the eyes of the face, but in the spiritual body that surrounds it. It is as if the throne were a nucleus of consciousness that absorbs all reality simultaneously, and filters, and chooses. This symbolism makes us think of something that goes far beyond celestial aesthetics. It speaks of a structure of divine perception, where everything is observed, but not everything is necessarily judged at that moment. Where vision serves not to watch, but to record, to witness, to wait for the right time to act. And this in itself is a profound change of mindset. Because how many times have you thought God didn't see you? What if in truth he always saw, but through these eyes that don't judge like humans, eyes that simply recognize, record, and sustain, as if everything were being recorded not out of control, but out of mercy, so that when the time of revelation arrives, nothing needs to be explained. Everything will already be clear. And those eyes surrounding the throne, covered by wings, by wheels, by light, perhaps they are also symbols of something that surpasses us, something that watches ceaselessly, but also protects, because to see, in the spiritual context, is to protect. It is to keep within reach. It is to say, I know you are there, even if you are not yet ready to be seen directly by me. This construction is fascinating because it places us within a narrative much broader than just God is watching. It places us in that dimension of spiritual testimony, where there are eyes watching not condemn, but to guard the continuity of existence, to record what will be needed in due time. And in that time, perhaps the Creator will then choose to look, not by chance, but by intention. That's why these passages shouldn't be read as empty allegories. When the Bible describes beings full of eyes, it's talking about layers of perception that surround God himself. And this reminds us that his gaze is not linear, nor chronological, nor human. It is a gaze that exists in a spiral, that envelopes, that penetrates, that circulates in silence, and that sees everything that needs to be seen, when it needs to be seen. Thus, those eyes can be like portals, like sparks of eternal time, waiting for the exact moment to transform what has been seen into action. Perhaps this is the secret of the throne, not the power to rule, but the power to see with wisdom, and stop seeing also with wisdom. Comment here, there are eyes in silence, because this is a key to understanding that the sacred is watching you, but not in a hurry, with purpose. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because after everything we've explored, divine concealment, the eyes of the watchers, the throne surrounded by beings full of vision, a question begins to emerge more clearly. A question that isn't theological nor doctrinal, but personal. And perhaps, for that very reason, it's the most disturbing of all. Why would God see you? It seems like a simple question, but it carries within it the weight of existence. Because if we accept that the divine gaze is selective, intentional, sacred, then we must consider that simply being alive is not enough to be seen. It's not about merit, but about frequency, about purpose, about how your life vibrates within the spiritual field where God's gaze moves. Because this gaze is not casual. It doesn't wander. It penetrates. And here we enter a very sensitive area, that off-responsibility of one's own light. Because many desire to be seen by God, but few are ready for what this gaze demands. He doesn't just observe actions. He penetrates intentions. He isn't content with the surface. He searches behind the scenes. He isn't impressed by words. He reads the silences. And this means that being seen by God is, above all, being naked before the truth. But then something even deeper comes into play. Because if the Creator sees with such intensity, why would he choose to look at someone like you, someone like me, flawed, contradictory beings, constantly moving between light and shadow? Perhaps the answer lies not in us, but in him. Perhaps his gaze is drawn not to perfection, but for the truth that lives within us, even though it is still under construction. It is at this point that the spiritual journey changes direction. It ceases to be a search for acceptance and becomes an opening to divine exposure, an honest willingness to say, look at me, not because I am worthy, but because I am real. Because there is something in every human being, even in their failings, doubts, and dark places, that pulses with the same spark that moves the throne. And when that spark is ignited with sincerity, it becomes visible even in silence. Maybe God sees everything. Maybe he chooses. But the real question is no longer whether he is looking. It is what, and you calls that look. What in your journey, in your decisions, in your silent transformation, echoes in the field of divine vision. Because he doesn't look at what the world celebrates. He looks at what the world ignores. At the details. At the invisible. At what you hide even from yourself. And that's why so often the feeling of being seen by God comes not in great moments of spiritual ecstasy, but in the intervals, in the pause between a mistake and a choice, in the moment when you think about giving up and yet you keep going. In those moments, something moves. And perhaps that's when his gaze turns, silently, firmly, with a love that needs no explanation. Comment here. I want to be seen with truth, because this desire, when it comes from the right place, is already a kind of prayer, and perhaps it has already been heard. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this content touched something within you. Maybe it was an answer. Maybe it just raised more questions. But most importantly, you were there all the way until the end, and that says a lot about your journey. If this kind of reflection resonates with you, if it helps you see the invisible with new eyes, then subscribe to the channel. That's what keeps this conversation alive. That's what keeps topics like these, which almost no one has the courage to explore, finding the people who need to hear them. Oh, and tell me in the comments that you made it to the end. Right. This message was from me. I want to know who really walks along in this search for something deeper. And if this video resonated with you, please leave a like. It's not just for engagement. It's to show that there's still room for this kind of truth. Your presence here already creates a connection. The like only confirms that. There's a video right here that complements everything we talked about. Click and stay with me there, because the revelation is just beginning.